A man chooses, a slave obeys.
Welcome to the Ethics in Video Games podcast, where we explore issues at the intersection of ethics and video games.
What follows is a series of graphic, interactive scenes that we can't show you.
All right, everybody, we're here with Rachel Kowert, PhD. Rachel is a research psychologist and the research director of Take This. Rachel, can you tell us a little bit about what Take This is?
Yes, Take This is the first mental health nonprofit that was formed to serve the gaming industry and the gaming community.
Awesome.
That's amazing.
This, and we gotta, can we later find out more about this? In fact, can you just tell us what do you guys do? I mean, that's amazing.
Yeah, we work to destigmatize mental health challenges and provide mental health information and resources that are tailored to the gaming community and the gaming industry. So as we know, there's specific mental health challenges with the industry, like burnout and crunch and harassment and that sort of stuff. And there's also special considerations when it comes to talking about mental health in the gaming community. So we serve as that bridge of information and research.
That's fantastic.
I love that. Yeah. How great is that? Are we the last industry in the world to get one of those?
I don't know. I mean, we've been around since, I want to say 2017. So we've been around for a while. So maybe not the last industry, but yeah.
Well, that's amazing, though. I had no idea that this existed, and I'm so happy to hear about it.
Yeah, thanks. We're happy to serve.
All right. Besides this, Rachel is a world-renowned researcher on the uses and effects of digital games, including their impact on the physical, social, and psychological well-being. An award-winning author, she's published a variety of books and scientific articles related to the psychology of games, and more recently, the relationship between games and mental health specifically. Recently, she founded her YouTube channel, Zeitgeist, which serves to bridge the gap between moral panic and scientific knowledge in a variety of psychology and game-related topic. And we're going to be talking about that today, at least in part about the gap between the moral panic that can happen and, scientific knowledge versus ignorance of what really is going on. There's got to be a balance between those two things. And she does this for a variety of psychology and game-related topic, and we're going to get into this. Last year, in 2021, Dr. Kowert was chosen as a member of the Game Awards Future Class, representing the best and brightest of the future of video games. Dr. Kowert has been featured in various media outlets, including NPR, The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, Wired, and Kodakoa and Polygon. All right, Rachel Kowert, welcome to the show.
Yay! Thank you for having me. Thanks for the lovely introduction.
All right. So we want to talk today about the big debates in the psychological impact on video games. So we're going to focus on violence, sexism, addiction, right? And I wanted to start with this. So, violence seems almost passé of a topic at this point, but really it never is. And as a parent, it's certainly something that every parent I talk to has at least some concerns about. And violent video games were accused of making players more violent since the 90s. Study after study seem to confirm this to the point where people like Congressman Joe Baca call for a label on all games that inform parents about the scientific consensus. So referencing to a consensus that video games cause violence as a consequence of violent video games. And now, as I understand it, the consensus seems to be that violent video games in their current forms may lead to increased aggression in players, but don't lead players to actually become violent. First of all, just to make sure we start on a solid foundation, is this an accurate description of the current consensus of the issue? Is there a current consensus on this issue?
There's a pretty strong consensus on this issue. At this point, we've been studying violent video games for 40, 50 years. And the vast majority of people would agree with the statement that there's no evidence to indicate that violent video games make you violent. Now, the problem is the conflation with the term aggression, because there are laboratory studies that look at, basically, you bring somebody in, you take a baseline measurement of some kind of aggression, usually like a fill in the blank, KI blank blank. You see that on a page, you write KISS. You play 10 minutes of what's considered a violent game. You come back, you see KI blank blank. Instead, you put kill, and that's considered an increase in aggression. And that's not an exaggeration. These are actual measures that are used in this research.
Can I ask if that's is that a good measure?
Well, that's the thing, right? So how ecologically valid is what you would say in the psychology world is that? Does that actually mean that I am then going to behave in a way that's different because of being exposed to this 10 minutes of video game play? And that's question number one. Question number two is that technically this would be a measure of cognition, changes in thoughts, which you could say is perhaps indicates aggression, but that aggression and violence are not the same, right? That doesn't mean I'm going to go rob a bank. That doesn't mean I'm going to beat somebody up and commit something violent. And the third thing to consider is this is, a laboratory study. What happens in a lab in a highly controlled setting it does not really reflect what happens in the wild world around us with all these different variables. But, even taking that aside, at this point, there's been a lot of like meta-analyses of this research and really looking at all of the variables. And when you consider personality variables, previous exposure to violence, peer deviance, all of these things are far more impactful on whether somebody behaves aggressively or violently than any media consumption, whether it's like a Tarantino movie film festival, or if it's, a weekend of Mortal Kombat. Those seem to have no impact at all when you consider other more demographic factors.
Mm-hmm.
Can we go back to the difference between, because you said conflating aggression with violence. So what is the difference? What is the difference that's supposed to be here?
I think generally speaking, it's a difference between a thought or a cognition versus an actual behavior.
Okay.
Although, you can have aggressive behaviors as well that aren't necessarily violent. Like when I play first person shooters, which I don't do very often because I'm terrible at them and I hate them. I get very angry. Yeah, preach. I get very angry and I break my mice. I've broken several where I slam it when I blind myself with a frag grenade and it makes me very frustrated. That is aggressive and that is a behavior, but it's not violent. I'm not throwing the mouse at my spouse's face.
Right. You're not being aggressive to somebody else.
To somebody else, right?
You're taking it out on inanimate objects, and then it gets sort of released, and it's sort of a cathartic moment, right?
You're correct, and more recent research from the Oxford Internet Institute actually says those actions are not a sign of aggression. They're not a sign of an increase in aggression. They're a sign of getting out your frustration, and that is actually a key difference if we want to talk about violent media changing your behavior and your thoughts to become more violent. Versus, the frustration of blinding yourself with a frag grenade, which I no longer do.
That's actually really interesting, right? Because you brought up the Tarantino example, right? Tarantino Film Festival, right? We're talking about super, super violent, but you're the passive watcher of that versus acting aggressively as a interactive, as a game player, right? Where you're interacting, what's going on. Is the impact itself different because what you're doing in terms of aggression or relieving aggression itself different?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's always the contention, right? That people are like, well, video games are interactive. But our brains are really good at differentiating between what's real and what's not. And we are very well aware that when we're playing Grand Theft Auto and accidentally run over a pedestrian, that is not analogous to me driving down my street and running somebody over with my car. The emotions are not the same. The intentions are not the same. So in that sense, they are similar in how they impact us as humans and our thoughts and our subsequent behaviors. And I like the example of the Tarantino movie, and I give it in one of my YouTube videos because I say, how I feel when I watch Django Unchained. It was a little too violent for me. I enjoy a Tarantino movie, but that one, the scene at the end in the house, it's very violent. But how I would feel if I was in that house when that was happening is completely different to how I feel just watching it. And the same is with video. If I ran somebody over with my car, I would be devastated, right? But I run them over like nobody's business in Grand Theft Auto because I'm just not a very neat driver in that game. But it doesn't mean anything to me because I know it's not real. Right.
So, okay. Kiss Kill. I want to go back to this, Rachel. This idea of, first of all, what was the idea behind the Kiss Kill? Is that just kind of subconsciously what your motivational set is like of whether you would complete a word in a certain way with the Kiss Kill?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a classic word completion task, which is looking for like priming, right? So what cognitions and what thoughts and what ideas are primed based on your exposure to this particularly violent media. But I mean, it does make sense if you're playing a game in which the objective is to kill other people in the game. It does make sense that thought would be primed and you would then complete the word that way. Deciding that indicates an increase in aggression is when we start to get in a little bit like, does it though?
Right. Is that the same? Is that sort of the same technique that magicians use? The mentalists?
Misdirection?
Well, no. They like when they can. I think the terminology is they can push. They can sort of push an idea, and then they can ask you a question, and then you give them the word that they are expecting.
That they're looking for, perhaps. I've never heard that connection before, but it could be.
I've been watching a lot of Penn and Teller, so I don't. That's it. That's all my knowledge. That's.
So beside the word completion, what other sort of tests have they done? Because I'm assuming it's always interesting. I'm always so interested in how psychologists try to mimic these tough real world experiences in as a research project. What else can they do beside kiss kill?
I mean, well, you have to be creative because you can't, follow someone around and see if they commit violent crimes or not. That's not really possible. So the other popular one is called the hot sauce paradigm, which is where you bring somebody into the lab and you say, hey, there's this other person in the room next to you that you don't know, but I can tell you that they dislike hot sauce. And I have this jar of hot sauce. How much hot sauce do you want them to eat? And you'd be like, well, probably none because that's cruel. And then you play 10, 15 minutes of a game considered violent. And then they ask you the same question. And then you say, oh, why don't you give them a teaspoon of hot sauce, a tablespoon of hot sauce, a gallon of hot sauce, whatever it might be. And if the volume increased, that's considered an increase in aggression. And again, it baffles me who came up with these measures because I don't really know exactly what that's measuring or how that indicates an increase in violence or aggression.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, this leads me to want to ask two questions. Essentially, the first is, I'm assuming these are not stupid people. These are psychology PhDs doing research. What were they thinking? Or is this just kind of creative thinking when you're trying to start researching something that has not been researched before? Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah. I mean, there is validity in measuring a change in your thoughts, like with the word completion task. There is validity in that, but the problem is it has low relation to like actual behavior change. The hot sauce, I'm not really sure. There's a really good paper by Malta Elson and I want to say Chris Ferguson, who did a whole paper talking about the hot sauce paradigm and basically being like, why? Why are we doing this? Why are people replicating it? Why is this a thing? That one's a little more out there.
Right. It reminds me of the old electroshock sort of thing that like the Stanford experiment and that sort of thing. It's like, well, I guess you're taming it down a little bit by changing it from electros to electricity to hot sauce, but it seems like the idea is the same, right?
Right, you're
similar idea.
You're harming somebody. I mean, the hot sauce is painful. Yeah, so I mean, isn't that the idea?
Well, I mean, but the Stanford experiments were about obedience to authority.
Right.
So those were about when you listen to the man in the white coat when he says gives you more, give him more shocks. Whereas the hot sauce that's your own decision to give the poor guy in the next room
right
a bunch of hot sauce.
Right. Somebody's not telling you, hey, go burn out his larynx.
Go do it. Yeah, do it. Come on, it'll be fine.
Right.
Yeah. So okay, let's say we've gone beyond word completion and hot sauce. We've learned from this. The games of the future might be really different than the games of today. And, I'm thinking about my favorite example is Manhunt VR 2042, right? Where I'm imagining, right?
Terrifying.
It could be, right? I mean, Jesus.
Sure.
How are the psychologists of the future, do you think, going to get better answers about the potential connection between violence and video games?
I mean, I think at this point, we're very well aware that media generally has a low impact on our behavior in the long term. Whether that changes if it's more, has higher visual fidelity and behavioral fidelity, like we talk about the metaverse or we talk about Manhunt VR. I mean, I guess that remains to be seen, but it would really have to get to a point where it's indistinguishable from reality, I think, to have any sort of actual long-term impact, because you're talking about a change in one's entire disposition and their behavior and their personality. They're going to become less empathy. Are they going to, all of a sudden change what they see as between right and wrong and that sort of thing? I mean, I feel like that's a long-term impact. Like I said, the other research we see on what actually impacts this stuff is peer delinquency, is family violence, previous exposure to violence, low frustration tolerance, things that are built over the long term and some of which are very ingrained in one's personality and demeanor. So I don't really see any indication that media, even if it is fully immersive, would have a more of a greater impact than these other variables on violence.
I was thinking, first of all, yeah, I mean, that seems obvious, right? But there's still obviously going to be a question of whether it has still a significant kind of impact, right? Or will it have a significant kind of impact? And obviously, we would still want to know that. I'm thinking of the sexism stuff we're going to talk about later, where let's say the Gentilly Study that says, that video games have a small but significant impact on sexism. And small but significant, right? It's still kind of interesting, at least to us who care about the impact the video games have on people.
Sure, but for the Gentilly Study, there's other studies that say they don't. So
right,
you have to take it with a grain of salt.
Right.
It all depends. Not to get too researchy, but it all depends on what you're looking at, how you're measuring it, if you're measuring it over time, this, that, and the other thing. Can media impact the way we perceive the world? Absolutely. Can the portrayal of women in certain ways impact the way, we think that women should be and or behave and or, that? Sure. Right. So that is something to consider. But, the thing that will come out of VR is finally people will be like, oh, those 3D games, those 2D games, those were no big deal. There's the real problem. This is the real problem now.
Right. And that gets us into the moral panic, right? Because now we're in the new technology and there's always some sort of moral panic about the new technology. Yeah.
Can you explain what a moral panic is? Actually, to follow that up.
Yeah, absolutely. A moral panic is the desire to have a simple solution to a complex problem. So it's the panic we have every so often around new technology as it being the source of all evils in society. And we see it over history. It actually, there was panic over the written word. No one will remember anything. There was panic over women doing crossword puzzles. Oh my God, they're going to learn how to read and this is going to be tragic. More recently, Elvis caused quite a panic in my father's generation. Dungeons and Dragons, video games. So like I said, when we get VR, then it'll be VR and video games will be like, it was fine. Just like now, Elvis was fine, right? It didn't actually collapse society the way that he was dancing on the stage.
Right. D&D did not actually cause a rise in Satanism.
It did not. D&D is super fun. I love playing D&D.
Yeah. It's my first love of gaming.
Yes.
Mine too. Actually, no, my second. Atari definitely beat it. Okay, so let's move on. I want to come back to the sexism stuff as kind of the last stuff, but video game addiction, right, has been another one of these issues where the numbers of video game of players that are supposed to be addicted to video games, from what I've seen, has just varied so dramatically. And I'm assuming this has to do with the way the kind of testing we're doing, the kind of definitions we're doing. I mean, I've literally seen claims that 1% of the population or 20% of the population of players are addicted to video games. I think the 20% came from South Korea. I'm assuming one of the problems is the differences in the way people define addiction. What are the kind of different ways that it's really weird where you have like numbers given that have such a wide range. What's the different ways that people might define addiction that might lead them to have really different results? Yeah,
a lot of these numbers come from before there was any sort of parameters put around how it would be defined. So I've seen from 0.2% to like 20%. And it's like something is wrong here. You're not measuring this the same way. But, people, again, kind of like with the fill in the blank with the hot sauce, we're trying to figure it out from the beginning. So it's like, how do we measure it? Is it about too much time spent? Is it about the repercussions that you're experiencing in another part of your lives? Like, what is it that you're measuring exactly. So now in 2019, the World Health Organization moved forward with the designation of gaming disorder and released a set of criteria. And then the American Psychiatric Association, which is not formally classified gaming disorder, but did put together a tentative set of criteria and put it in the back of the book being like, maybe this is a thing, maybe this isn't a thing, but if this is a thing, here's some, boundaries that we can start looking at. So there's different ways to define it, but it has at least become a little more universal now with the World Health Organization moving forward with kind of their criteria. I mean, I have problems with their criteria, but at least there are criteria there.
Right. What's the difference, by the way, before we get to anything else, between the APA and the World Health Organization in terms of their criteria?
They do. APA has 7, I think, and the World Health Organization has 5. But the APA is North American based, and the World Health Organization is obviously a global organization. But they kind of go along the same parameters, where you have to have experienced distress. I think it's 12 months or more. You had to meet, the majority of these criteria, which are things like, I have sacrificed other activities to play games. I spend more time playing games than I wanted to spend playing games. Those sorts of things. It's mostly around more time spent than intended and consequences in other areas of your life because of playing games.
Out of curiosity, do you think addiction is kind of the right term for us to use? I mean, clearly, a lot of people have problems with playing too much or playing in ways that they maybe personally don't consider healthy. Or obviously, if it's kids, often it's a parental concern. Do you think replacing the word with like excessive or pathological gaming or anything else might be better? Do we want addiction to be the term that people use?
The way that a regular person, a non-clinical person uses addiction and the way that a clinician uses addiction is vastly different. I do not think that games are addicting inherently, and so I do not think addiction is the correct term. Do people use games in a way that causes problems? 100%. Do people use games problematically? I like the term problematic gaming. Because of course they do. Of course there are some people that are using games maladaptively. Oh, that was my doorbell.
Someone's at the front door.
I have a package, everyone. There's absolutely people who use games maladaptively. But the difference between an addiction is a term that has a set of clinical terms, that has a treatment plan. Your understanding may have a biological basis or a behavioral basis, but we don't have any of these understandings around games. And when you look at the research far more points to games are being used as a maladaptive coping strategy for something else. Depression, anxiety, isolation, whatever it might be. And that is very important from a clinical sense, because you're going to want to treat the depression or the anxiety or the isolation, not, take away the games, which tends to be the strategy for like gaming addiction centers and this sort of thing, because you're taking away the coping strategy that's helping them process these feelings and emotions. So yeah, I think addiction is the wrong term. And I have not seen any kind of sufficient evidence to indicate that games themselves are uniquely addicting as like a medium.
Can you talk a little bit more about the research? First of all, I guess what kind of research would tell us if games are addictive? And problematic gaming it seems like such a broad term, but I'm not sure if there's. I don't have a better suggestion, but what kind of research are we talking about that settles this kind of question?
Well, I mean, for me, like the key research is gameplay having a negative impact on somebody's well-being? That's kind of the baseline coming from a mental health perspective. Right. That's kind of the baseline for me. And there was a really good study that came out last year, I want to say, again, from the Oxford Internet Institute. They're doing a lot of good work. They worked together with Nintendo of America and Electronic Arts and actually managed to get server-logged data of playtime. And they looked at the relationship between playtime and mental well-being. And they actually found not that more playtime led to worse well-being. There was no evidence that playing more inherently led to worse levels of well-being. And they said, well, wait a minute here. If we're saying that playing too many hours is the key argument, that something is addicting and something is engaging in a way that's maladaptive, we're looking at it wrong because it's not associated with these negative well-being outcomes. And instead, by limiting it, you may be preventing the positive well-being outcomes that are associated with it, like social community and social closeness and that sort of thing. So for me, you have to be able to show that it has a negative impact on our mental health. If you want to, put it in the diagnostic statistic manual of mental health disorders, that seems like a good baseline.
A little earlier on, you talked about tolerance to frustration, and I wonder, do games make us more tolerant to frustration? Like, is it sort of or less tolerant to frustration? Is there any research to talk about? Oh, I remember what it was. It was one of the things that you listed as being another factor for indicating violence or indicating a more aggressive sort of.
Yeah. Low tolerance for frustration is one of those key indicators, especially for adolescents or children, for outbursts of anger because they can't handle the frustration. Do games help us generate that skill? I can't say that I've necessarily seen it linked specifically to frustration tolerance, but I have seen games linked specifically to teaching strategies around persistence. And I feel like that is related. Continually trying to beat the enemy at the end of the water temple and Ocarina of Time, you have the persistence to continue to try new strategies. So that could be tangentially related, but I haven't seen it specifically linked to frustration for tolerance, but tolerance, frustration. But that would be interesting. Anyone listening looking for a PhD project, that might be an interesting thing to look at.
I want to go back to the idea that essentially any of the problematic gaming that we might see that might be attributed to addictive behavior might instead be part of a coping mechanism.
Yes.
How would we figure that out, right? Research-wise.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, well, for me, what I usually tell parents when I start talking about, my kids play too much. Is it Christmas break? Are they playing a lot? That's just increased engagement. Or how do you tease out between a period of increased engagement, problematic gaming, and addiction? For me is the person in question suffering negative consequences in all areas of their lives, and it all seems to be around gaming. So are they not going to school or not doing their work? Are they not going to work? Are they not bathing properly? Are they not doing any other activity that they normally would do? And are we seeing this, in their social life, occupational, educational, physical, across the board for 12 months or more? Now, if we are, and gaming is the common thread, then what I advise is going to see a mental health professional who is culturally competent in and around games. So at takethis.org, we actually have a list of clinicians across North America who identify themselves as understanding that games can be spaces for social communication. They can be spaces for stress release and that sort of thing. So they have that understanding when they say, hey, games seem to be serving this central purpose. And they, instead of saying, it's the games, take the games away, they can say, okay, what function is this serving for you? Let's tease this out and see how we can, not have all these negative consequences anymore that are happening in your life.
Right. That seems very, very reasonable. I mean, that's not
right. And a lot of parents have that question, and I don't want to discredit the experience that people have that I know they have, saying my kids won't get off the games, my kids are only playing games. They seem very frustrated or angry when they're playing it. These are real experiences that parents have, but it's not about the game. Right. It's about something else underlying.
I've had lots of problems stopping to play games. Right. And I remember we had T. Newen on the show. And, he talked about, throwing away civilization and then digging through the trash, going, through the big trash. And I was like, I've practically done the same thing. Right. But we're obviously people who, either had a problem or prone to a problem, but also managed to deal with it. Where does that kind of stuff fall into this whole talk about addiction, problematic gaming, etc. Just kind of the I can't stop playing, but I know it's bad for me, but I'm also kind of eventually going to take steps to deal with it.
Right. These are self-regulation skills. These are important. And again, if you find that you are lacking these self-regulation skills, or if a parent is recognizing that their child is lacking these self-regulation skills, that's when going to see a mental health professional can be really beneficial, because there are strategies that can be learned and taught in and around. And one of the key issues is time management. And I talk about this with parents a lot, especially parents of younger children, like preteen children. They say, I tell them 5 minutes and they're still playing, and I get really frustrated. And I try to explain to them, they don't know what 5 minutes feels like. First of all, they can't very properly gauge what 5 minutes is. You don't learn that till you're like late 20s, really, how to gauge time effectively.
Really?
But secondly,
or never.
Games are meant to be, or ever. Games are meant to be engaging, right? So you don't want to leave after 5 minutes. Like you said, you should get off, but you don't want to, because they're designed to be engaging. That's the whole point of them. So it's about learning strategies like, okay, I know a Fortnite match lasts 45 minutes. So when I tell my child 5 minutes and I see they just started a Fortnite match, that's kind of an unreasonable expectation, because there's social pressures to playing Fortnite with your friends. There's all these other things. There's engagement issues. So with parents, I say, help teach your child time management, but also accommodate, the space of the game itself. How many times my mom said, pause World of Warcraft? Lord, okay, you can't pause World of Warcraft, Mom. I'm in the middle of a dungeon. Okay, I can't do it. It doesn't work. But having just a basic understanding of what's going on. And then you can find that a lot of the fights around time and time management in games will at least reduce, because you have a better idea. They're not lying when they say, I can't pause World of Warcraft.
Right.
And you'll understand it. Yeah.
Okay, let's move to our third issue.
Yes.
To many people, the biggest concern about video games today is sexism. And this is obviously sexism, not just in video games, but also in the video game industry. I read I think it was a DGC survey that said the top, I think 1 or 2 or 2 and 3 things that developers were worried about was sexism in video games and the perception of video games as being sexist. I've also looked at a bunch of studies that said that playing games with sexualized female characters increase hostile sexism and rape myth acceptance. Right, so hostile sexism meaning it's not the put a woman on a pedestal sexism. It's the
go to the kitchen and make a sandwich kind of sexism.
That's exactly it, right? And rape myth acceptance is exactly what it means, right? More likely to not believe women, where essentially they say they have been raped. Then there's that Gentile study or Gentile study that I mentioned earlier, right? That playing video games by teenagers in general corresponds to an increase in sexist attitudes, and that has nothing to do, I guess, with just specifically sexualized female characters, but that kind of speaks to the background of video games in general, though I have questions about the way that study was done. So, it seems to me that things like sexism and racism they're really hard to define in any kind of non-controversial way, which seems to make it really hard to say that something is sexist or racist. I realize that kind of hostile sexism. Notice hostile sexism means it's sexism, right? So given this, what are the challenges, do you think, of studying the impact of video games on things like sexism?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of challenges with studying the impact of games on any outcome, just because they're multifaceted spaces. They're constantly changing. Is it the content or is it the social environment? I am much more inclined to lean towards the social environment, kind of festering these ideas and attitudes and beliefs more so than the content itself. But that said, when we look at work in mental health representation, for instance, in the media, we do see that the representation of the mentally ill as violent, for instance, people who have mental health diagnoses are far more likely to be victims of violent crime than perpetrators of violent crime. But in the media, we see them constantly as perpetrators of violent crime. And that does change the ideas and stereotypes and dispositions that we have and attitudes towards people who are mentally ill.
Right.
So I can see that there's lots of elements here that can be teased apart. And then you have the element of the industry itself, which is no secret that it has had, its own news headlines in the past couple years about the way that it treats anyone who's not, a white male, basically.
Right.
So there's a lot of elements to tease apart here. I think the kind of biggest challenge now is moving forward. And, we were just talking about GDC, and Anita Sarkeesian gave a great talk at GDC about 10 years since Trope's first video games. It's been 10 years since she came out with that series on YouTube. And we actually have come a long way. I think there's even a slide she put up that says, like, we won. Like, we have come a long way. Look at the female protagonists we have today that we did not have 10 years ago. Look at the conversations we're having about the industry now that we were not having 10 years ago. And it was most certainly the same then, if not worse. So I'm optimistic about this one, maybe. But it's still, something worth discussing, something worth researching, something worth, figuring out how to make it go away.
Yeah, I saw that talk as well, and I think the one thing that struck me the most about it was that she said that going back and looking at the videos that she made 10 years ago was horrifying her now in a way that she hasn't been horrified in a while. Nobody's using dead hooker bodies as shields in their shooters. Right.
Anymore. Yeah.
Right.
But they were 10 years ago.
They were 10 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah. It's progress.
Good for her for getting the conversation started by being such a big mover in that conversation.
Absolutely.
Sure.
Really, really fantastic. The fact that we've gone from that to, again, this being an issue that developers are so aware of and so and want to do obviously something about while we're going through the companies themselves and how the companies are trying to deal with it. But I want to go back to kind of the original question, which was, as a researcher, how does a researcher look at a question like that? Right? At a question like, are these just, if we go back to the representation, right? Are these just fun, or are they actually having an impact on sexism? And again, part of the question is that how much is loaded into that term? What
that's
can a
the
research
question.
do here?
Yeah. I did a study looking at, like sexist beliefs over time based on playtime and that sort of thing at the University of Münster when I was there. And I found that there was no change in sexist beliefs over time that was related to playtime specifically. So you can kind of look at it that way. And even if you do find an increase, the same question would remain of, does that actually mean they're behaving differently? Or does it mean in the context? Because these studies too are very much, do you play video games? How much you're clearly priming them to think about the context of video games, right? So if you're thinking about video games and you're thinking about, what's that, Dead or Alive? Is that the volleyball game? Like if you're thinking about, the representation of women in games and that sort of thing, you already have that on your mind and you say, oh, do I agree with this statement that women should be pretty and not heard? Oh yeah, okay, So it's hard to say, does that actually mean they behave that way with their partners and their friends? Who's to say?
Right,
but we do know that there are repercussions in the industry. Or we do know that culture is there. That's why I say I think it's more about the social impact and less concerning about the way that women are represented. I think they should be represented more accurately and of course. But I don't think that necessarily has a significant impact on the way that somebody believes or behaves or perceives women.
I still want to push a little bit more into the into getting the actual way that the research is done, right? So you mentioned that, let's say, and it's great because I didn't know you did research on this. So you mentioned a particular question, right? That you asked. So what sort of questions did you ask to kind of see if there's sexism there?
I can actually, let me pull this up. I'm doing a study right now. Looking at the social impact of games, and we have questions on sexism, so I can pull it up and I can actually tell you what these questions look like. They are like validated scales that have been created by, not me, but I'm using them in the study. So here's a measure of hostile and benevolent sexism. Every man ought to have a woman whom he adores. Strongly agree or strongly disagree. Many women have a quality of purity that few men possess. So that's going into the benevolent sexism. Women are more pure. Women should be on the pedestal kind of thing. Women should be cherished and protected by men. When women lose to men in a fair competition, they typically complain about being discriminated against.
Okay.
Oh, here's a good one. Once a woman gets a man to commit to her, she usually tries to put him on a tight leash. So it's just like, what are the perceptions of the roles that women should hold in society generally? And if it's not an equitable position to any other gender, then it is.
Very, very, very interesting. What? Out of curiosity, what do you think? Are these? Is this a good way to do these kinds of studies? Or maybe maybe not the way I should ask this.
I hope she does.
Well, right.
Because I'm doing them, so.
Right, that's true, right?
I mean, it's a good way to assess how the perception is. If the idea is to, what is the way you perceive women and their role in the world? Do you perceive them as equitable to men, or do you perceive them as less than? Then yeah, it's a good way of assessing that. But I guess the key argument is this at all related to the media you're consuming, or is this related to the social environment in which you are living? To me, that's what's more important to teach. Because we know that some people agree with these statements and some people absolutely believe that. But it's like, why do you believe that? Is that something that you were taught from your parents?
Right.
Or is that something that you learn from the way you see women portrayed in the media?
So in some ways, this mirrors the violence issue, right? In the sense that it's probably not games. Except that games are part of this larger thing that we're all learning from this sort of social environment that we're in. Yeah,
that's the thing, though. I think the social environment is it's a little different when it comes to sexism, because generally speaking, these are beliefs that are learned versus behaviors. Mm-hmm. It's a lot easier to change a belief. Like I mentioned the example about mentally ill individuals and the way they're portrayed in the media, stereotypes. These are all kind of like cognitive beliefs that are very informed by the people around us. Whereas actually committing an act of violence that can be informed by our peers if our peers are violent, but there's other factors that are going into that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The socialization that comes from games. I want to go back to this idea of, okay, so we're asking these questions, and I'm assuming, so are we trying to draw a correlation between the amount of time played and how people answer these questions? Is that, or the kinds of games played and how, is it like the violence research where I'm going to give you 10 minutes to play this game and now I'm going to ask you to answer these questions? How does that work?
Yeah, no, these aren't so much experimental studies, which is what that would be with the violence where you play the 10 minutes. These are, looking at relation to usually amount of time you play and the kinds of games that you play. It's typically how it's done. But every study will be different. Like some will have these questions and strictly just do it with the time played. And that's when you come up with the research question, like, you don't know what kind of games they're playing, or you don't know how the women are portrayed in the games are that they're playing. They could be playing, Among Us for 20 hours a week. You don't know, right? Those don't have any gender. So there's a lot of, you have to look at each individual piece of research very specifically and be like, how did they measure it? And what conclusions are they actually drawing? Like, what can you actually say versus not what are they saying? What can you actually say from what they actually measured in this instance? Yeah,
I'm thinking of that Gentilly study where the question was, do you think women's natural primary function, I think, is to have babies? I think that was their question. And I remember thinking of, who would say this? People, these days.
Just like these questions, who would agree? Right. Some people agree.
I think that the questions that most of the questions you brought are, I can see more nuanced answers than that. But he's also asking teenagers, and I don't know. I mean, when I talk about, so when I teach, about sexism in, my classes, sexism is so complicated. That's why part of me is just so not skeptical exactly, but cautious about this idea of asking such simple, direct questions to measure it.
Here's the other thing, though, that why I say you need to really look into the research, because the Gentilly study, I don't remember it exactly off the top of my mind, but if I recall correctly, the numbers that come from these are very middle of the road. So it's a 1 to 5 scale, and the numbers are like 2.5 for people who don't play games and 2.7 for people who do. Oh, wow. Yeah, that's small but significant, but to me that means nothing. And I know that small but significant still can be significant. But if it's like less than a half point difference, is it really? Especially since we already have these concerns about how accurate this measure is in terms of the way that people behave.
Right.
So I think the headlines, we get a lot of headlines about the sexism and the violence or whatever, but when you really dig into it, we find a word completion task, or we found an average difference of 0.2 on a scale that we're already thinking is kind of dubious. So
Right.
got to keep that in mind.
Let's actually move that to the reporting part of all this. Right. So, right. Obviously, there's a temptation here for, popular media to exaggerate the meaning of any given study. That kind of goes without saying, right? Because, grabbing headlines is what kind of media tries to do. But what do you see as the challenges of reporting the results of studies like this for researchers? What's responsible of reporting of studies like this look like?
Reporting the good and the bad. It's hard because everyone wants a clickbait headline and nobody likes the headline, researchers say it doesn't really make so much of a difference and it can go either way. Nobody's gonna print that headline. But we also see that in research itself. Like there's been a large push to publish research that has non-significant results. Nobody will publish research that has non-significant results. They only want the p is less than 0.05. So there is a challenge there, but I again, optimistic, I guess, because when COVID started, we started seeing headlines publishing the positive. Mm-hmm. The Oxford Internet Institute study, for instance, got a lot of press about games being related positively to mental well-being. So maybe we're starting to see a little bit more flexibility, and it doesn't all have to be, the world is ending and games are the source of it.
I wonder if that started because like the coincidence of that happening with the beginning of COVID, and all of a sudden kids having to be home all the time, and parents trying to figure out what to do with their kids for many, many, many hours. Shlomo, you have a boy, like, is it like people going, please God, is it really okay for them to play games?
Not be bad. Yeah, no, I think it did coincide. It did coincide. The timing was nice in that sense because video games were on everybody's mind for sure.
Right. And we're all looking for good news at that time. We went from our son having an hour of screen time a day to our son having, 7 hours of screen time a day or something. Right. And,
Same. So I feel you.
And that concern is there. And it sure is nice to hear a study that says, hey, don't worry. Right. Everything's okay. Right. Where in normal times you wouldn't have the audience for a study like that. Well, maybe you would, because how many parents don't think about the amount of time their kids play video games, right? So maybe it's always a good time to do that.
I think it's always a good time. Whether the reporters think it's always a good time is something else. But
all of these things start with the reporters too, right? The reporters are like, well, what am I interested in? What do I want to research? What do I want to find out? What's like, who's doing studies on this?
Reporters, when they talk to me, they're like, give me some statistics about how bad things are. And I'm like, well, I can't really do that because really at the end of the day, it's actually not so bad. And they're like, oh, we'll find somebody else to talk to who will give us the headlines. Yeah. Yeah.
That itself is so you have this kind of selective process, both in journals and in popular media, that is essentially selecting for whatever is going to make a headline, and negative information usually is what is going to make the headline.
Well, yeah. And that's also, a human disposition. We're looking for challenges and threats, and as humans, we are disposed to that. So it's not, some of it's an unconscious bias, but I do hope we could all be a little more cognizant of, speckling in the good news too.
Yeah, it's interesting that when at the beginning of COVID, when we're all under so much threat, that they start looking for hope.
Yes, you're right. That is interesting.
So, parents and public officials, right? A lot of times they want to make video game policy based on what they read in places in the popular media, usually about what research has discovered. It's interesting to me, and we had an episode about South Korea and China and how they deal with the way they look at the problem of addiction. But South Korea has 8 different government ministries dealing with kids and game addiction. China, right, was it last year that it started banning the internet gaming for kids except for 7 to 8, Friday to Sunday. California tried to and failed to ban the sale of mature video games to minors. And parents follow, right, obviously, what the government is supposed to be listening to experts on this. Is there anything you think public officials need to consider when reacting to psychological research about video games?
Yeah, they need to consider the positive and the negative, and they need to consider, the role of parental guidance. It's one thing to have age labels. I think age labels and content labels from the ESRB, which came out of that original legislation that was fueled by moral panic. But I do think that is a good thing to come out of it, because parents can be informed about what's the content that my kids are consuming. Do I think it's appropriate for them or not? I'm very wary of governments coming in to regulate our leisure time, which is basically what it is. They don't regulate how many videos I can watch, how many, music albums I can listen to, but they do provide warnings like, hey, this might be explicit, or hey, this might be for mature audiences. So I think it's important to maybe just leave the regulation to that, and let parents decide what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. I did do an interview about the China bill that limited playtime, and I will say that my perspective was very different from the perspective of, there was a woman there who was Chinese. Her perspective was, it's great that the government is regulating it, because now I'm not the bad guy and I can just say, hey, it's the law. That's a totally different perspective to take than I think we normally take in the West. I mean, I'm in Canada, you're in the United States. So I'm more of a fan of parents should be informed, and parents should take the onus on regulating this within their households and deciding what's best for them and their children. And the government can just provide us with information to help us make the best decision that we can make.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting in the case of the U.S. at least, all of these like the ESRB and all of that are industry created. Right, they're not government created, except that the industry only created them at the threat of the government getting involved. Right, yes. So the industry wasn't going to do anything until the government threatened
their hand. Yeah, but the ESRB is wonderful. I mean, and they continue to grow, and they even have parentaltools.org now, which literally will walk you through how to set parental controls on like any system and limit spending and limit time and all of that stuff.
Yeah, that's great.
So yeah.
Can I go back to the interview about China? Sounds really. I know this was supposed to be our last question,
yes,
but the interview about China sounds super interesting. How did China reach such a different conclusion about the dangers of video game addiction, do you think, than the rest of the world?
I am not well informed enough to say for sure. I mean, if I had to hypothesize, I think that games are very, very popular. And they have a different approach to regulation than we have over here. And I think it's just kind of a combination of those two things. Like I said, the parent that was in the interview, I can send you the link. It's on YouTube. She was very relieved. She was very relieved that the government passed. Whereas if it were me, I would be like appalled if the government passed a law saying my kid could only play video. Like, who are you to tell me what my
Right.
So it's just a totally different perspective.
Interesting. All right. Rachel Kowert, thank you for coming on our show. This has been super fascinating. Is there any last words you want to tell our audience? Anything you want to leave them with?
I guess just at the end of the day, just keep in mind games are just one of many things that we do. And the research says the effects are generally more positive than negative, or at the very least neutral. So we can get off the moral panic train until, VR becomes more affordable.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right. Good podcast. Play nice, everybody.
You can subscribe and listen to all of our episodes wherever you listen to podcasts.